Hello viewers, today let us examine Sir Arthur C. Clarke's brilliant novel Sands of Mars. Sir Arthur C. Clarke is one of the best-selling authors of science fiction and represents both a distinct style and way of writing science fiction. A master of the craft, Clarke, along with fellow science fiction writers including Isaac Asimov and Robert A. Heinlein, is considered among the greatest of the 20th century science fiction writers. Arthur Charles Clarke was born on 16 December 1917 in the English coastal town of Minehead, Somerset. As a child, Clarke enjoyed reading science fiction, pulp magazines like Astounding Stories, yet he couldn't pursue this interest formally because he couldn't afford a college degree. In Sands of Mars, the life stories of various crew members and visitors aboard the spaceship Ares are intertwined with each other as they struggle against both natural forces on an alien planet and aspirations and desires of people back on Earth. The novel is often considered a prelude to Clarke's explorations of the theme of life in outer space, especially on the planet Mars in the Odyssey series and other works. With the launch of the Mars rover, many of Clarke's fiction writing on the subject seemed to look prophetic and attracted fans from among both the professional writers and scientists. The life of Sir Arthur C. Clarke. The eldest of 4 children living with their widowed mother, Clarke's childhood was not easy. His mother, while managing to provide for the family, could not pay to send Clarke for a university. While Clarke looked for work to support himself, he never gave up scientific inquiry or his interest in writing, even making his apartment the headquarters of British Interplanetary Society. He first worked as an auditor and then as a radar specialist in the RAF during the Second World War. All the while, he was publishing several papers in science fiction magazines and teaching journals. His first piece of fiction published was The Rescue Party in Astounding Science in 1946 May. Clarke finally managed to enroll in King's College after the war and completed degrees in physics and mathematics in 1948. While attending the college, he wrote his first novel, Prelude to Space. He worked as an editor in a science magazine after this and soon expanded his interests to undersea explorations. To pursue this, he traveled to Sri Lanka and fell so deeply in love with the country that he permanently moved there and stayed on till the end of his life. A prolific writer, Clarke's writings include novels, short story collections and non-fiction pieces. Novels include Childhood's End, The City and the Stars, The Deep Range, A Fall of the Moon Dust, Rendezvous with Rama, Imperial Earth, The Foundations of Paradise, The Songs of Distant Earth, Hammer of God, and 3001, The Final Odyssey, and A Time Odyssey, which was published in 2003, 2005, and 2007. Short story collections include Expedition to Earth, The Sentinel, and the collected stories of Arthur C. Clarke. And non-fiction pieces include Interplanetary Flight and Introduction to Astronautics, Exploration of Space, The Coast of Coral, Voice Across the Sea, The Promises of Space, and How the World Was Won Beyond the Global Village. During his lifetime, Arthur C. Clarke was showered with recognitions and awards. He received 3 Nebula Awards 2 Hugo Awards and several honors including knighthood and awards of recognition for his work in promoting science and international relations through his work in Sri Lanka, film nominations, and the honor of having orbits, stars, asteroids, and even dinosaurs named after him. His work has also inspired the institution of awards for promoting science fiction writing in Britain and worldwide, as well as honoring discoveries related to space. Clarke is perhaps also the most visible science fiction writer in modern media, with several collaborative film projects based on or related to his science fiction works, presence as one of the narrators of the Apollo landings, more than one television show starring him, and numerous references in popular cultural texts to him. However, Clarke's life was not always easy. While he had to struggle during his formative years with meager means at home in his childhood, during the later years he suffered from paralysis due to accidents and was confined to a wheelchair. He was also the center of a social scandal with accusations of pedophilia. These charges were disproved later. Yet, he triumphed all these challenges to produce ever-exciting stream of science fiction writing and achieved recognition for the place of imagination in inspiring real technological innovations. Clarke died at his adopted home in Sri Lanka in 2008. Published in 1951, The Sands of Mars is Arthur.C.Clarke's first science fiction novel. It set the stage for Clarke's entry into imagining space futures, as his later novels describe, and it is written even before technological developments in space travel could provide Clarke material for his fiction. Many features of the planet that Clarke imagined were later found to be true, and several technological suggestions in the book were later realized to enable better explorations of the red planet. The New York Times, Galaxy Reviewer, and several writers and critics hailed this fascinating work on its publications. Sands of Mars was also later published in an omnibus edition as part of the Space Trilogy, along with Islands in Sky and Earthlight. The novel, Clarke's first science fiction novel, begins with Martin Gibson, an astronaut author, preparing for his first space flight. As the space shuttle prepares to take off for Mars, Gibson is taunted by the pilots for the sensitivity of his characters in the science fiction books he wrote. In spite of very powerful drugs to counter space sickness, the author becomes sick psychosomatically and is very embarrassed. While the author struggles to get past the medical tests required to be actually allowed into space, readers are introduced to a breathtaking account of the sights he could see: the earth, the stars, and the other celestial objects. Many of the scenes leave the author annoyed, as they were exactly as he had imagined and written about them from his research from photographs and films. As Captain Norden of the spaceship Ares prepares the ship for takeoff, there is discussion on the quality of writing by Gibson and a general understanding that he would include a record of the voyage in his next science fiction work. Gibson's imagination anticipated the crew aboard to be different from ordinary people, but was severely disappointed to see that they were nothing like the adventurous cowboys he expected. In the second chapter, the readers read First, about the corporation that ran the mission to Mars and had invited Gibson to chronicle its experiences for a 3-month period that it would be exploring the planet Mars. There are detailed descriptions about how the crew float about on the spaceship, the different custom-made pieces of furniture in Gibson's room, like the shaving mirror that turns into a porthole for stargazing. Comparing himself to a colonist or explorer, Gibson records the breathtaking view of the stars as the ship takes off. On board, Gibson is introduced to Jimmy Spencer, Hilton, a star astronaut who had returned from a risky mission to Mars earlier, Dr. Scott, Bradley, and Mackey. His impressions about the spacecraft describe it to have a honeycomb-like structure, and this, for Gibson, was its most fascinating feature. There are several references to literary authors including D. H. Lawrence, Edgar Allan Poe, and even Chaucer when different crew members are seen reading or talking about them. Life on the spacecraft is described in great detail, and you read even of the films they watched on board. In the chapter 5, events like a meteor hit that caused considerable damage to the ship are discussed, and the concerns of the corporation and the trade are laid ahead of the necessity to inform the public truthfully about events aboard the ship. Yet, the shocks of the unknown were not only from outer space for the characters of the book. We learn in chapter 6 that Gibson was originally an engineering student at Cambridge University who had a brief affair with a much older female student, Kathleen Morgan. There, and Jimmy was the product of the relationship. In what Gibson describes as a collision with fate, so far away from Earth, he discovers the ghosts of his forgotten past. The different geographical features on Mars were named from poetic mythology, Elysium, Utopia, etc., and Gibson was fascinated by them. He spent several days learning about them. By the 8th chapter, Gibson has floated onto Mars, becoming the first civilian to achieve the feat. On Mars, Gibson and the crew go their separate ways. Gibson meets the Chief Executive Officer of Mars, Warren Hadfield, and Mayor Whittaker, who run the colony from the base at Port Lowell. Jimmy accompanies Gibson in his initial trip round the colony on Mars. The neat rows of houses, hospitals, and vegetation that had grown to impressive heights due to low gravity were all interesting to Gibson. He discusses the future of the colony with Hadfield, who is keen to make Mars as self-sufficient as possible, given the vast distances that materials have to travel from Earth. Gibson also meets Whittaker's kids and was amazed at how strange kids who had never known Earth were. The settlers arriving from Earth were not allowed to bring kids, and all kids on the planet were born there. While exploring the city, Gibson produces regular radio broadcasts for listeners on the Earth. In the 11th chapter, Gibson conversations with the pilot flying him to Port Schiaparelli, the second city on Mars, inform readers of the complex relationship between the Space Research Funding Organization on Earth and Mars and the explorations into Jupiter, Saturn, and other planets. Gibson promises to write a blistering expose about cheese-paring terrestrial politicians, adding, "You mustn't underestimate the power of press." We also hear of organizations like the Interplanetary Development Board that Hadfield heads. On a trip by a passenger jet to an outlying research station, Gibson's plane collides with peaks found on Mars and is then hit by a hurricane. They find themselves among slender, leathery plants of a type that they had never seen before. The leaves rose vertically out of the ground in long, thin streamers and were covered with numberless pods which looked as if they might contain seeds. The flat sides were all turned towards the sun, and Gibson was interested to note that while the sunlit sides of the leaves were black, the shadowed parts were a grayish white. It was a simple but effective trick to reduce the loss of heat. The team explores the nearby area and discovers a small group of kangaroo-like creatures, the unsuspected natives of Mars. There were 10 of the creatures in the glade, and they were all too busy eating to take any notice of the intruders. In appearance, they resembled very plump kangaroos, almost spherical bodies balanced on two large, slender hind limbs. They were hairless, and their skin had a curious waxy sheen like polished leather. Two thin forearms, which seemed to be completely flexible, sprouted from the upper part of the body and ended in tiny hands like the claws of a bird. Too small and feeble, one would have thought to have been of much practical use. Their heads were set directly on the trunk with no suspicion of a neck, and bore two large eyes with wide pupils. There were no nostrils, only a very odd-shaped triangular mouth with three stubby bills which were almost making short work of the foliage. A pair of large, almost transparent ears hung limply from the head, twitching occasionally and sometimes folding themselves into trumpets which looked as if they might be extremely efficient sound detectors, even in this thin atmosphere. They appear to have limited intelligence by human standards and are vegetarians living on native plants. It is later revealed that the plants are being cultivated by the researchers to enrich the oxygen content on the Martian atmosphere. The project and related others are being kept secret from Earth. In the meantime, Spencer has formed an attachment to Irene, Hadfield's daughter. Hadfield, along with some of the best scientists on the solar world and nuclear engineering scientists, have been working on the project Dawn, which involves the ignition of the moon Phobos and its use as a second sun for Mars. It would burn for at least 1,000 years, and the extra heat, together with mass production of oxygen generating plants, will eventually, it is hoped, make the Martian atmosphere breathable for humans. When Gibson investigates further, Whittaker explains to him about the struggle against funding cuts from Earth by those fighting for sustenance of colonies on Mars. Gibson and others encounter Martians who can change skin color and witness the outbreak of an epidemic of Martian fever. The idea of teaching Martians like Squeak, who becomes Gibson's pet, to cultivate the airweed plant important for oxygen supply seems eerily close to the training of colonies for generating resources. Gibson finds himself so persuaded of the importance of Mars as a self-sufficient world that he applies to stay on the planet, and is invited to take charge of public relations, in effect to sell the idea of Mars to potential colonists. Literary imagination versus technological conquest in space travel. The main character, Martin Gibson, is a writer with a large amount of fictional writings on space travel even before he takes an actual trip. The reader is continuously reminded of the lack of correspondence between what science fiction writers project as the romantic and adventurous trip of a space shuttle and the reality of zero gravity, space sickness, and meteor strikes and the danger of an actual trip. The character of Gibson finds his own fictional peace and the available photographs of sight in space to be more exciting than the actual experience. He reiterates the power of imagination over both bodily reactions and the control imposed by advanced drugs when he produces symptoms of space sicknesses psychosomatically. Clarke's works have always privileged the role of the literary imagination in prefiguring technological innovation and enabling a wider audience to appreciate what actually happens in space exploration. All through The Sands of Mars, the accounts of Martin Gibson provide people on Earth a detailed account of events and challenges on Mars. The corporation that funds the explorations hires him as an official chronicler and he prepares to include the material he collects into his science fiction work so as to encourage people to pay for travel to Mars. Thus, the genre of science fiction becomes a crucial interpreter of technological innovation and conquest. In addition, the work of ancient poets as well as more recent novelists and dramatists provide astronauts with ways to understanding the new worlds they encounter. They thus provide them a stencil of the available civilization on Earth to compare their findings in space. Names of geographical features, struggles against natural dangers, and social interactions between space travelers are all described in terms of literary references. The second theme, big corporations, colonization, and space. Arthur.C.Clarke moved to Sri Lanka quite early in life. It is highly probable that the colonial histories and newly successful anti-colonial struggles in the South Asian region as well as Australia has significantly influenced his writing on the colonial enterprises in space such as that on Mars. Clarke highlights the concerns of capital and profit that determine how crucial decisions about space explorations are taken. In Sands of Mars, Captain Whittaker explains how continuing exploration by man is vital for his mastery over the material universe, or else he will simply stagnate in his own world. But this sort of argument is no use with the taxpayers. The situation is similar to the British colonial enterprise in the colonies that sought increasing returns from its investments, and when that failed, attempted to exit without responsibility towards those left behind. Clarke sees a proactive press as a hedge against adverse decisions by capital controlling space exploration. In some ways, the attempts to tame the Martian populations and train it in cultivation reeks of neo-colonial attempts by former colonizers, and space becomes the new frontier to be conquered. Martin Gibson. He is an author with an overactive imagination about space travel. He is actually an engineering student who moves to the arts after a mental breakdown. In many ways, he represents the therapeutic potential of arts for a soulless society. While initially supportive of increased budget cuts to space stations on Mars, Gibson soon realizes the importance of continued experiments there and converts into an ardent supporter of the works of scientists stationed in Mars. In the personal realm too, he grows out of the confusion of his misdemeanors in youth and takes responsibility for his son Jimmy Spencer, even helping him out work out his relationship like a good parent. Thus, the character of Gibson is not flat and evolves to maturity. He is also shown as a warm and affectionate to non-human creatures, yet takes on a godlike role versus them when he suggests that they be used to the benefit of human beings on Mars. Gibson combines both an interest in scientific inquiry and imaginative fiction, much like the author. We could say he is influenced by the writer's life. Jimmy Spencer, on the other hand, is a young engineer who is revealed to be Gibson's son. He explores Mars without any real development in perspective and represents quite a naive and immature view of life there. Dear learners, we have come to the end of the lesson on Sands of Mars. I hope you enjoyed the lesson. I trust that you would go back and read the book in its original form. Thank you.